Hi, everyone. We're just running, I think it's 3 minutes late. And as Deborah says, we don't do that at this conference. So I'm just waiting for the yes, you can go. And then, so if you can give us like 30 seconds, a minute, and you can look at Deborah's smiley face, or we can chat amongst ourselves, and then off we'll go. So just give me 1 second. I'll wait. I'll just double check that we're allowed to start. I know I'm in charge, but I'll just check. Don't want to break the rules. Okay, so I can see that our room is filling up nicely. No pressure, Deborah. I am just always so excited to see Deborah on the SAPIC stage. It's like my annual fix of positivity and learning lots and just watching somebody talk about their passion and how their passion has evolved, but it always comes back to supply chain. So when I first met Deborah, it was all about how supply chain saves lives when she was working at the Gates Foundation and with a real focus on public health. And now it's all about how supply chain can save the world with a bent on circular economy and sustainability. And just watching that transition and progression, I guess it is, because ultimately we need to save the world in order to save lives. And as Deborah will say, supply chain and inventory. It's all about inventory. So you see, I've been listening over the years. In her bio, she describes herself as a supply chain enthusiast. And I'm actually going to draw on my familiarity and say she's not an enthusiast. She's a supply chain nerd. She's absolutely passionate about it. The passion comes through. She knows what she's talking about and she walks the talk. You know, this is what it's all about. It's not about people who are going to talk about a whole load of theory. It's about people who really do want to make a difference and they really do want to see supply chain management be front and center and making that difference. So, Deborah, I'm going to hand over to you and let you take it away. And thank you very much again for being here.
Thank you, Jenny, and thanks for the invite. It's always a pleasure to join this conference. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. And lovely. Always my favorite conference to come to. This is the conference I promise new content for every year, which of course means I'm excited to share this with you, and it's my first time presenting all of this. So thanks for coming along with me on this journey. Today we'll explore, is green industry even possible? So to get us started, we need to clarify a few points. First, of course, what is green? So what is green? Since you've come to this session, I'm hoping you brought a perspective with you. If you've been to one of my presentations before, you'll know that this is a participative session, but please don't leave. It's easy and fun and painless. But we're going to have a vote for everybody to ask ourselves, what is green? So to get us started, we are going to get out our phones. Oopsies, that doesn't help. All right, let's get our phones out. We're going to go to menti.com. I'm going to do it with you, make sure everything is working great. Menti.com. Once you get there, you can enter the code you see at the top of the screen there. I'll read it in case it's small, 67167920. And we're going to build a word cloud together. This is going to be the toughest of the survey questions. So if we can get through this, I think we can do well. You're going to have 3 votes. So you can enter 3 separate words, as you'll see. And so you can think about, what does green mean to you? It's hard to talk and type at the same time, but I'm going to vote as well. All right, and we will see as votes come in, they'll look like this. So if you could, please join me, pull out your phone or a browser tab, go to menti.com, enter the code you see, and if you do all of that properly, you're going to be able to vote on what do you think it means to be green. Give this a couple of moments and see. Thank you, a couple of you, for joining me here in this virtual room. We've got neutral, renewable, effective, efficient, using less, circularity, sustainability, and sustainable. We've got another vote coming along. Thank you very much for joining us. If you're just coming here, we are exploring what does it mean to be green. So before we can say, is it possible to have green industry, we need to kind of define what green sounds like. So green, we're voting here, making a word cloud at menti.com, either through your phone or a browser tab. Once you go to menti.com, you can enter the code you see at the top of the screen. Get a chance to write 3 words down and push go. Right now, renewable and sustainable are pulling ahead. Loving that we have those two. We'll explore these two throughout today's presentation and the difference between sustainable, renewable, regenerative, all important words here. All right, we'll come back to this. So if you're just joining us, keep your phone handy and stay on that page, and we'll come back to this so that you don't just listen to me talk at you for the next 42 minutes. All right, what is green? My version lines up with what a lot of you thought around sustainability. Interestingly enough, the first time this word was used, I won't make you guess, was in 1713 by, can you imagine, the mining industry. Because in mining, they need timber as part of their mineral processing. So this first use of the word sustainability actually has a lot to do with forests and timber. Here from one of my favorite thinkers in this space, Walter Stahel, describes it in balancing, taking what we can, so maximizing the stock or capital, in this case a forest, while conserving the capital itself, meaning making sure we still have more to take. So this word sustainability came because this fellow sat down and did the math on how many trees he could take and still have a forest there. So said another way, in simpler terms, use as much as we need while still having something to use tomorrow as much as we had yesterday, or while rebuilding the environment so tomorrow looks better than we did today. So that's where we get into renewable or regenerative type of thinking. So this is my version of green. So then what's industry? It's a lot simpler. My version of industry is B2B, which reminds me of a very interesting paper that actually looks at supply chain and the supply chain industry or the supply chain economy. This paper is researched by these two women. Very interesting. They break the economy down into 2 parts. They look at the American economy and they dramatically simplify the definition of supply chain. And it may seem like a bit of a broad definition and perhaps overly generous, but I think it's quite a cool one. And for those of us who see everything as inventory, it fits pretty well. So what they say is here are the general industries and the workforce in America. And again, broadly speaking, they split the economy into B to C, going to consumers, and everything else, which they call supply chain. And they find a lot of people work in this industry, 43% of America's workforce, or 53 million jobs. So this is how we're going to think about this. I'm going to ask you 2 more questions. So if you've got your phones nearby, please pull those back out again. Thanks for the couple more votes we got here. 2 questions here. This first one is so that I know how to better tailor what I'm going to talk about during this talk. So I would like you to tell me which part of supply chain you work in using the SCORE model with plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable. Enable is my favorite because that's where inventory management is. And again, if you're just joining us, you're going to go to menti.com from a phone or browser tab, put in the code that you see, and you're able to vote here. And I appreciate your participation so that we can have a bit more fun together and I'm not just talking at you the whole time. We've got a good plan. We've got some good enable folks. So glad to see you here. Enable, I just feel like, is the one that never gets enough attention, but really is our management function through. And we've got several folks from deliver. Here comes another enable. Let's see if we can get one more or not. All right, we'll come back to this. One more question for you then is how much, this is a quiz question, how much material in tons enters the global economy each year? Is it 40 billion tons, 65 billion tons, or 100 billion tons? This is a quiz question just to see if you know. We'll talk about it, of course, and you'll find out the answer. Leaning towards 65 or 100 in the early votes here. There's one vote for 40. 100 billion is pulling ahead. And you seem to know the right answer. It is 100 billion tons. So here we go into our green industry here. Is it even possible to have green industry? So if we put all of our definitions together, then we have green industry as defined by supply chains that use as much as we need while rebuilding the environment so tomorrow gives us more than we have today. So let's jump on in. To structure our time together today, let's think about a version of a SIPOC diagram. I'm going to make a bit more simplified version where I'm going to collapse supplier into input and customer into output and wrap the whole thing in a system. So we're going to explore each of these different components, and let's start our exploration of green industry with green supply chain inputs. So we use raw materials to fuel our economies, of course, our supply chains and our processes. And in fact, as many of you identified, we use 100 billion tons of materials. That's 10 million Eiffel Towers that enter the economy every year. And it looks something like this. There's a lot to look at here. On the left, we see process inputs across minerals in purple, ores in orange, fossil fuels in blue, biomass in green. Biomass is the organic material grown inside the earth. And we can see how the items flow, combine, continue through the life cycle phases you see at the top: take, process, produce, and so on. And then over on the right, we have end of use. This is a view that was produced by an organization called Circle Economy for their 2020 Circularity Gap Report. Their 2021 Gap Report is out and focuses on carbon emissions. So let's look at these two numbers over here. 92 billion tons of the material that enters the economy every year comes from the earth, and 8 or 9 billion tons come from other supply chains. And these are the inputs we use into our global supply chains, of course, so that they can actually run. What would it look like if we could get inputs from each other instead of from the planet? So let's look at 4 potential inputs into our supply chains that's not the planet. Most of us use the planet today. Some of us don't, and so let's explore some of these different options. One source of inputs into our supply chains is from within our own supply chain. Our supply chains right now produce outputs and byproducts, value streams and waste streams, maybe, if we're thinking about it like a value stream map. And these outputs can be used again. One example I'll give you is from a chemical company called BASF, and they've really leaned into this concept around the world. They have a site called a Verbund site. It's searchable online. And the idea is that they exchange all the different outputs from their materials, and they define it as the intelligent interlinking of production plants, energy flows, and infrastructures. So for example, heat that's produced in one factory would be sent to another factory that needs to use that heat. Water that goes in cold into one process, comes out hot, is then pushed to a process who needs hot water as an input. You have 6 of these sites around the world. They have the advantage, of course, of being a large supply chain, but the principles that they use could be used by a supply chain of any size. And of course, we use this concept already today. For example, we do our best to use inventory we already have before we buy more. We take care of our equipment with MRO and spare parts. We reuse pallets and packaging. And often we'll even have a water treatment in our factories before we can replace it back into municipal water supply. So this is really about expanding what we know how to do today and really getting towards green industry. Another option here, this is 2 of 4. If we imagine that every supply chain in the world becomes a source of raw materials for another supply chain, so we could take the idea that BASF is doing and push it across companies. One example of this is the Kallenberg Symbiosis in Denmark, which is made up of a series of bilateral agreements among different companies. And again, you're probably doing this today. If I take an example from Procter & Gamble, They've really been pursuing a zero waste to landfill strategy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And they've avoided sending 5 million tons of waste to landfill over these last 10 years by selling out of spec products to other supply chains. So for example, as they're making a home detergent or a laundry and something is out of spec, they can sell it onto car washes. Lots of benefits here, of course. They can take a step towards their zero waste to landfill goal. They can avoid the scenario where that material manages to get all the way through an economy and never adds any value to it. They don't pay to dispose of that material, and they can create a revenue stream and, of course, also reduce their carbon footprint. So it's a pretty nice setup for them. Third, it's possible to get material that's been used before from the commodities market. Of course, we have commodities markets we buy from today, and they already include post-industrial or post-consumer materials. Brokers and marketplaces, of course, have emerged around the world to connect different supply chains for these materials. One example is an asset management and marketplace company called Reaply, which offers supply chains the chance to actually leave items as themselves, extend the life of assets, and then sell them on to each other. And this is really cool. The less we do to each of the materials we use again, if we can leave an item as itself, it actually adds a lot more value to our supply chains and to the economy, because it takes less effort to have them add value again. So this idea of somehow leveraging a marketplace or a broker is another way that we can bring in and expand that 8 or 9 billion tons. We can expand that number and take industry more green. Circular materials also could be made with biology. So this is a newer space called biomanufacturing, or some calling it biofacturing. One example that's quite interesting, which is not made in a lab really, is the idea to compete with styrofoam, the traditional plastic foam packaging. And you can take agriculture byproduct and press it into a mold, add mushroom spores, and after about a week, you end up with a material that is cost competitive and functional competitive with our traditional packaging. So we're starting to see biology come in into play here for our materials, which is quite cool. And after that material is used, if it can't be reused again, of course, it can break down in about a month. I know I said 4, but I added a 5th one in here, which is also kind of cool. So this is the idea. When we did the word cloud, there was some sustainability, some renewable, and then we sometimes hear this word of regenerative. We're seeing, as we go to the grocery store to buy laundry detergent, you might have seen a bottle that says made with ocean plastics. We see leggings and shirts and whatever made from plastics pulled out of the environment. HP makes ink cartridges from plastics that are ocean bound. Or we could kind of go really crazy and end up with this idea of pulling carbon out of the air and making materials out of it. Now, the last time I took science was a long time ago, but the research here that's happening is pretty amazing, and we can start to imagine actually reversing where we are today, which we know we're in a bit of a pickle when it comes to climate change. So, inputs. They were once called primary or virgin materials, as in they've never ever been used before. That's the 92 billion tons of material. And now we're seeing circular inputs. We'll talk more about circularity coming up. Today it's 8 to 9 billion tons of materials a year, but we want to increase that number. All right, that was input. So let's take our phones out. And again, I've been talking at you again. I'm going to ask you 3 questions about inputs, and we'll move on to process. What input does your supply chain use the most? This is a type in, and it doesn't have to be the one, but several of you are planners. Several of you are enablers, and so you should have some idea if it's a plastic, a metal, if you're offering a service, what that item is. Maybe it's a biological material. See if you can be brave and vote here on what is the biggest input. Metal, thank you very much. Rubber, organic material, excellent. Other votes, if you know. Sometimes I find that we don't always know what we use as an input. Fuel makes a lot of sense, especially if you're in the deliver area, copper, or maybe you are a transport provider, and that is the big input. A lot of inputs into our supply chains. Another vote for fuel. Very good. I'll give this one more minute. Let's see, by a whole minute, I mean 5 seconds, and see if we get one more vote in. Quite a range here. Let's ask our second question. This is just to see who's paying attention. The word sustainability was first used when? In the 1700s, in the 1900s, or by millennials? What do we think it is? We can vote here. Thank you very much for the people who are voting. 1700s, 1900s, or by millennials. Throw in a little shade here. Keep things interesting towards the end of the day. And thank you for paying attention. It was 1713 by the mining industry, which I always just think is pretty funny. In the next 3 years, now this is next level survey. On your phone or screen, you're going to have the chance to have a slidey bar. So in the next 3 years, I could see my supply chain using inputs from, and you have a couple of options that we just walked through. And you get to slide from no way, definitely not going to happen, to we already do this right now. So using materials from your own operations again, using materials from another supply chain, we got a lot of no ways from somebody. But I don't believe it, because if you reuse shipping containers, pallets, water from a municipal source, that's all treated and used again. Commodities markets, biology, or the environment. We got another couple votes coming in. I like the way that this program shows the results, because then we can kind of see the spread, which is, I think, really interesting to see rather than just an average. So we've got some already do votes, which is great. And we've got some no way, it's not going to happen. We'll see if we can get one more vote in here. And again, this is a slidey bar, next level. All right, we'll come back to this. Leave your phones out. So that was inputs. Let's go to process. Process, when we think about green industry, is really about something called smaller circles. So what is a smaller circle? Today, our economy, up until this point, it looks something like this. We've got a customer, supplier, and so on, and it flows in a line, often referred to as a take, make, waste, in a linear economy. So materials have one shot at adding value, and after that, we declare them waste. In contrast, there's an economic theory that you've probably heard of already called the circular economy that says materials that we discard actually have more value to add. They can circulate. Materials are either renewable or technical. Renewable meaning they can return to the earth and add value, or technical meaning they can't return to the earth. And these materials, instead of having one shot at adding value, can add value again and again by circulating through the economy, hence the name. So these circles can be big or small, and they look something like this. Perhaps you've seen this before. It's called the butterfly diagram. The idea here is to keep the smallest circle for as long as possible, because you do less effort, you need less inputs, less time, less money to keep an item as itself for as long as possible. So use and reuse is the best idea for adding value into the economy. And then we could refurb, remanufacture. Notably, recycling is the loop of last resort, the circle of last resort. So in this way, we want to keep the smallest circle possible. So if we think about the impact or the effect that this would have on our supply chains, if everything in our supply chain was used again and again, including cardboard packaging, for example, if that shifted to always be a reusable piece of packaging, or with the product that we're offering out into the market. So what if our businesses change to be product as a service? How would this change what we're doing today? So let's look at 4 effects of smaller circles on our supply chains. First is around point of sale. Today, I find we work really hard at getting that product sold and out at that point of sale. Everything we do is about right time, right place, et cetera, et cetera. And that really is a linear model. When we think about shifting to more of a green model where we can reuse materials, give them more opportunities to add value than they have today, then the point of sale becomes the beginning. So today it's sort of the end point, and tomorrow it becomes the beginning point. If we were to shift, let's say, to a repair model, to a product as a service model, leasing, if you're in Deliver, which several of you are, it's very likely that you are offering product as a service through transportation. There's a lot of our supply chains today that are already outsourced, and so this should feel somewhat familiar to us. And this is the idea that we take even more steps towards that direction. So again, we start to see more robust pallets. We see better industrial packaging is starting to come out, and that helps us to have these smaller circles where items can last even longer. Second is around repairing more than we build new. And this one is an interesting one, and I think tough for us to imagine in some circumstances where it could shift. I'll give one example in the consumer world of a company called TerraCycle and an offering they have called Loop. And their whole goal with Loop is to take one single-use packaging around consumer lives like cosmetics items or even in fast food restaurants and make those into reusable. And it seemed rather impossible, but last year actually they announced a partnership with a few fast food restaurants, Burger King and Tim Hortons, to trial reusable packaging. So we'll see how that goes. I'm keen to keep an eye on how it develops. So if we were to see more of this shift towards single-use repair, cleaning, a few of the ways this will impact us, of course, in supply chain is that the materials coming into our supply chain will look different. To take an item that's already created and then have to assess what it needs to be out adding value again. This is going to expand the use of how we think about asset management. Today, we typically use asset management for capital equipment if it lasts a long time or it's a very valuable item. And similarly, inventory management will start to get expanded, and we start to bring, I think, these concepts of asset management, inventory management will start to collapse. Quite cool. Slower inventory turns. So inventory turns are really interesting because if we again imagine that items will remain as themselves for as long as possible, but today we measure health in supply chains with inventory turns, and the more we push through our supply chains, the healthier they are, because everything we have today is set up towards this idea of a single-use, single-shot linear economy. So more movement is good. Kind of depends on how we end up measuring all of this, but if we could say, gosh, if we want reuse to happen, then we shift actually from a focus on high inventory turns to a shift on high utilization. This is going to be a transition for sure, but an interesting one, I think, if we start imagining the different points in our supply chain and measuring use instead of measuring inventory turns. And this is, of course, really tough for me because I love inventory so much. The last one is that if we are allowing items to remain as themselves for as long as possible, then that means we don't start from scratch every time and we can actually go faster. So if we aren't starting from a mine, instead, we're going to take something that's already been made and see if we can't refurbish it and use it again. So then there's a lot of fewer steps and we can actually go faster. It'll actually cost us less money. And you might be thinking, hold on a second, because the labor is going to go up a ton if we shift to this model, and it does. But because we're not starting from a mine and having to do all the value-added steps in between, the amount we spend on materials comes down dramatically. The amount of money that goes in actually comes down, and it offsets the increase in labor. If we think about the models around circular economy and the businesses that are already emerging around circularity, they actually save money, even though they spend more on labor, which translates into cheaper cost of labor. And I can think of several countries right now, economies and supply chains, that could benefit from a cheaper cost of labor. So for processes, they were focused on inventory turns and now focused on reducing, then maximizing resource use. So about leaning out our processes and then really making the most of the items that we have today. And of course, we already do a lot of this today. So it's really an extension or an expansion of what we're doing now. All right, back to our phones. If you're all still with me, hopefully you are. We're going to do 2 questions. This first question is about your process, and you only get one vote here. So your process mostly builds new items. You mostly repair and refurbish. You're selling a service or something else. And from your responses earlier, I would assume several of you sell a service in distribution transportation. And again, you can find us at menti.com and enter the code at the top of the screen. So most processes are building something new or selling items as a service, which is great. The more we sell as a service, of course, the more we get to drive up utilization. It used to be that we all had our own fleets. We all had our own warehouses, our own manufacturing facilities, and all of that, for the most part now, is outsourced. And that's been a big shift. I think we would have thought it was pretty crazy a couple years ago, and yet here we are. Perfect. And one more. Do you use a lean mindset today? Yes, no, or we try. So if we think about lean as about finding and eliminating waste, this idea of circularity, or green is about finding and monetizing waste. So I find the two go together quite nicely, and most supply chain professionals are trained in lean, Kaizen, Six Sigma, some type of process improvement where we try to eliminate items that don't matter. It looks like most of us at least are giving it a go. We know what we should be doing, perhaps not all the time. Almost tied. Quite cool. All right, back to our SIPOC here. Let's go to outputs. So I've already mentioned this once today, and you've probably heard about zero waste. Many companies are down the path, and it might be more fair to say zero waste to landfill. So remember this picture and the outputs. We talked about the input side before, and now we're going to talk about the outputs on the other side. And here it's a bit small there. The categories are emitted, dispersed, added to stock, and wasted. And all of these are outputs today. So let's explore how outputs can get to zero waste. There's 3 ways, and you probably already do this, so I will not belabor any of these points. The first way, of course, is that we can actually reduce what we create. This is tightly related to lean, that all of us are at least trying to do. And it is also tied to quality. The higher our quality, the less we scrap, the less defects we have. It's tied to planning. The better we plan, the less obsolescence that we create. And of course, tied to a business model. So if you're already in a product as a service model, you'll have less waste produced just by nature. And so as we start thinking about the processes through our supply chains, the best way to reduce waste is just to remove a process that is unnecessary. So if we have too many emissions from transportation, we can shorten our supply chains. If we have too many quality issues, we can remove some troublesome step that we have. And if there's too many widgets going out in the world, of course, we can compete with a product as a service offering. So first way is we can reduce what's coming out of our supply chains. The second is we can divert the waste. So we know that we're always going to produce some sort of a byproduct, even steam, water, anything that's coming out the other side. And there's interesting examples of how this is happening now. I'm currently sitting in Seattle, Washington. I would love to be in Cape Town in person, and fingers crossed we could do that next year. But down the street from me, there is a whiskey producer, and as they go through and make whiskey, the first step is to essentially make beer. So you take grains, take all the sugar out of it, and then the sugar continues in the process to become alcohol. But then you still have this grain left over. And we see cool examples happening. The one happening here down the street is that they give those grains then to the dairy farms here in Washington State. Other examples, these grains go on to become granola bars, like snack bars. So we're already seeing diversions that are happening. One interesting example that I've heard from a consumer good company is that they had this interesting observation in their process that they would bring in empty bottles to fill from a supplier. They would take those out of the box. They'd put them in the filling line. They'd fill them. They put them in a new box, and they ship them away. And they realized that they're just going through these boxes. So they actually committed and did refactor their manufacturing line to leave these bottles in the boxes as they come in, fill them in the box, and then just close the box up and the box just continues through the supply chain. Certainly a financial investment to do that, but this company is well on their way to a zero waste to landfill strategy. And the last thing we can do, of course, is sell our waste. And we know how to do this today. We've been doing it for a long time. Industrial waste is a $57 billion a year industry in the United States. And we have examples of this, of course. Companies can take a byproduct, let's say from a paper production process, create resins, and these resins can become other products. Carbon dioxide that's created can be captured to make algae, building materials. Food production can be captured, the bio scraps, and they can make plastics out of it, or textiles, etc. And of course, as much as we can leave an item as themselves with those smaller circles are even better. So if we can keep household appliances or anything through our supply chain as themselves, that's the best item, and we can sell that. So outputs that were once value streams and waste streams, if we think about a value stream map, and now in the future, and for some supply chains today, they only produce value streams. This idea of zero waste landfill could be seen as only producing value streams. All right, here we go into systems. I am going to ask you 2 more questions here, if you're willing to play along. The question is, we measure our waste streams today. Yes, we measure them. No, we measure them. We measure some of them. Or I'm actually not sure if we measure our waste streams. And waste could look like byproduct material waste. It could look like time waste. It could look like emissions. It could look like financial waste. Any of the waste that comes out of our systems today. We've got some yes, no, and partial, but at least everybody's sure, which is great. And the second question for you right now, I could tell you where geographically our largest waste streams are created. So depending on where your supply chain operates today, do you know where these waste streams that we're partially measuring are produced? Yes and no. I find we don't really like to measure our waste streams. And so this is kind of a tougher one for us to know where things are being produced, where byproducts are being produced. Pretty good split in the end. All right, let's go cover this last section here around the systems of green industry or green supply chain. Systems in the future and for some supply chains today look more like nature. And in nature, we see ecosystems that's made up of different parts that work together to create bubbles of life. And in supply chain, we work together to create bubbles of value. We want to create interconnected systems that are dependent on each other, just like in nature, and we'll have 3 types of touch points, so we'll explore the 3. The first, of course, you're expecting this, is the physical touch points, our material flows. So as this material enters our supply chains, the idea is that they'll come from secondary, renewable, regenerative sources, and if it's coming from a secondary source, it's been used again already, and if it's from renewable, it's being grown somehow where it can grow back. We take these materials into our supply chains, we use less than we needed before, and we let them last as long as we can. And as they come out of our processes, of course, we want to sell those on, either as finished goods or as byproducts. So that's where the vision we're painting for green industry. And this can happen in a couple of ways, of course. If you're in a traditional product sale model, these physical touch points are as we can imagine. We want to sell the end item. We might also sell spare parts or secondary materials to be used for this item as well as it's serviced. We could have product as a service where we service the item, we sell the use of that item, and we could also have just a reuse model where we do see some organizations starting to emerge around reclaiming items, refurbishing them, and selling them new. Physical touch points, I think, for us in supply chain are the easiest ones to identify. But then we can move on to financials. My first job ever after uni was as a supply chain analyst, and I got to take our logistics data and figure out what actually happened. And it was so interesting because if I looked at the physical flow, I didn't always know what was happening, but of course, if we follow the money, we can normally figure out what's going on. If we think about a world where we're shifting to selling items to each other and maybe using a broker, maybe not, I don't think we're going to spend the time setting up all the contracts like we do today with the deep strategic relationships that I suspect will continue. But we'll need to have ways to flip those on and off and have these relationships be more modular. So I think there's going to be a shift in this idea of a touch point as we move forward. We have a lot of financing for green, sustainable, circular types of models today. Private equity, private market funds are starting to come out from folks like BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, private companies like Henkel and Phillips. So there's very interesting investments into these types of models here as we start to see a more sustainable or long-lasting business model that has less risk. And the last flow in our supply chains, of course, we know is the information flows. And I always chuckle about this on sometimes the information doesn't quite catch up to our operations. I was managing a launch once and it was very late. We were all kind of sticking around waiting. It was during a launch. We had to get one more shipment out and the shipment was there on the dock. The driver was there. But because our ERP system hadn't recognized the inventory yet, we were all just hanging out until it went, ta-da, the inventory's here. And then we could drop the order for it to leave. So inventory flow is very interesting. And again, we'll need to have more of a bolt-in, bolt-out system to allow us to move more towards this green idea where items remain as themselves for as long as possible. And we'll probably have a few different ways of valuing performance. For example, moving from inventory turns over to utilization. So where systems were once what I'll call silos of minimal communication, they are now moving into this interconnected idea of a ecosystem. All right, I'm just going to ask you one question. We'll go into a final ways to get started, questions to ask in your own supply chain. So curious, in your supply chain, we have strong visibility to physical flows, financial flows, information flows, and I added emission flows because that seems to be a very popular topic these days. You got options. Not at all. I have no visibility to this. Or I have real-time, 100% perfect visibility to this flow in my supply chain. If you're willing to come and answer one last question for me, you can let me know how these flows are working for you. Physical flow, financial information looking high. Financials actually looking pretty strong there. Emissions, it's a growing space. Many of us, I find, have been kind of voluntold that we need to go and reduce our emissions. But most supply chains I talk to don't know how to do that yet, and probably because we haven't traditionally measured them. And so it's a new area we need to start to measure. About what we'd expect here, right? Physical flow is quite high. Financial flows, we have to know because we're sort of the stewards of the money flowing through our supply chains. Information flow, we do okay. And emissions is definitely a space for us to all work on collectively as an industry. All right, what now? I'm going to leave you with 5 questions to ask your own operations and get you out of here on time. So the first question to ask is, what materials do we use the most and where do they come from? And of course, by answering this question, you're going to start to view your supply chain through a green industry lens. Depending on how many miles your different materials travel, this is actually pretty hard to answer. So where do they come from, as in all the way back to the planet or wherever they're sourced from? That's question 1. Question 2, how far does our most popular product travel? The iPhone travels all the way to the moon before it's ever turned on. So again, this might be a tough one depending on how complex your products are and where they're all coming from in the world, but our items travel very far. Third question, what byproducts do we produce the most of and where? We touched on this earlier. I think one interesting way to start thinking about byproducts and how far our most popular product travels is we could almost have like a fully burdened mileage. So you have, an iPhone, how far it travels, but then if we could also say, what about all the byproducts that then come off the processes, and does that extend how many miles are traveled? Where are we most vulnerable? So if we're not starting from scratch every time, we don't have to cross as many borders, then we should be less susceptible to risk. So we can start imagining green industry as a way to reduce our risk profile. And the last one, what are our emissions for the last 5 years? And again, many of us are finding ourselves in a hot seat right now. Some analysts estimate that supply chains contribute as much as 90% of a company's carbon emissions, which makes sense, I suppose, as we start thinking about it. But we will be highlighted in the years to come. So the concept of a circular economy, of course, says, look, every material has value. If we think about these 100 billion tons of materials every year, we buy them as supply chain professionals. So we make the decisions of where those come from. Another option is we can use a circular supply chain, which is an interconnected system that uses secondary and renewable inputs to generate value by reducing and maximizing resource use. And of course, this is what we've walked through today: inputs, process, outputs, and systems. If any of this is remotely interesting to you, I invite you to join us at a nonprofit I run called the Circular Supply Chain Network. It is free to join. We have learning resources, including a kid's book we just launched this morning about Betty the beach toy who gets another life. We've got live events and on-demand replays. We have a university challenge coming up in February. And of course, we're on LinkedIn. Though I didn't leave much time for questions, I have managed to end on time for the conference. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for the willingness to participate in the polls. It makes it more fun, I hope, for both you and me. And is green industry even possible? I hope that we've all answered yes, it is. And many supply chains are doing this today.
Loads of green, blue, gone colorblind at the end of the day. Loads of blue, bubbly thumbs up, Deborah. Thank you so, so much. You've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to read out this one question. Is there any way to incentivize companies to find innovative ways to use their waste? That's from Nikki.
Really good question. Really good question. I think there's several, the obvious ones on financials that we don't have to pay to dispose of them anymore. I think what I'm seeing right now is there's lots of these challenges being launched. Just spoke with an industrial company yesterday saying that they'll launch a challenge for supply chain professionals around the world to say, what should I do with this waste stream? And the winners actually get a chance to implement it. And there's, of course, monetary prizes for them, but it's less than hiring a big consulting firm. So this idea of let's come together as a community and solve these problems, all we do all day long as supply chain professionals is actually figure out our constraints and solve for those constraints. And so I think if we start to imagine this idea of green industry as a new set of constraints to solve within, I think we're going to be pretty delighted by the solutions that we all come up with. So my advice is to put the challenge forth either to your own organization or open it up to your trading partners or as a public challenge. And I think you'll be pretty delighted with the solutions that you're finding.
Yeah, brilliant. Always, always. I actually just posted on LinkedIn because I can multitask that every year I find your presentations inspirational, education, and just so full of positive energy. And I think that's what we need more than anything else. And I really do. I so admire and respect all of you speakers for coming onto this remote stage and giving us that energy that I think we all need. So I really am so, so grateful to you always and forever. I'm going to buy Betty the beach toy. I need to know her story. And the next time anyone is asked, what does green mean? What does being green mean to you? Why did nobody put Kermit the Frog? That's what I want to know.
The good news, Jenny, is Betty the beach toy is free. It's on our LinkedIn page. It's out there. So enjoy it. Have some fun with it. I think sometimes a lot of the stuff is saving the world is serious work, but we all love supply chain so much that we really should have fun while we're doing it.
Yep. Amen to that. And what a great statement to finish up on. Thank you all very, very much for being in Deborah's presentation. And thank you for contributing. I love the presentation things. They make it so much more interactive and fun. and your involvement has been really valuable. So, but Deborah, thank you again so much. Please remember to fill in the poll if you haven't gone already, and make your way to Jane Tierney's presentation, which is the last of the day. Well done for hanging around. I'm full of just so much admiration for all of you for embracing this online world, and us too. I'll say that too. So well done. Thank you very much. And Deborah, here's to next year, and hope that we can now go and have a glass of wine together.
Yes, ideally. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody.